In the harsh desert of the American Southwest, where survival meant choosing between pride and hunger, a young Apache girl made a decision that would change everything. Her small hands trembled not from the cold morning air, but from shame as she reached into the white settlers' garbage, searching for scraps that might keep her alive another day. She had no idea that across the dusty street, hidden in the shadows of a crumbling adobe wall, a legendary Apache warchief was watching her every move. What happened next would transform a starving child into one of the most feared and respected warriors in Apache history. This is not just a story of survival. This is the true account of how desperation became strength, how a moment of deepest shame became the first step toward legendary courage, and how sometimes the most unlikely encounters changed the course of not just one life, but an entire people's destiny. The girl digging through trash had no name that mattered to the white world, but she would earn one that would echo through the canyons and strike fear into the hearts of her enemies for generations to come. The sun had barely touched the eastern mountains when Ayanna pressed herself against the rough wooden walls of the trading post. Her stomach cramped with familiar hunger, a constant companion that had followed her for 3 days now. The settlement of Tucson was waking up, and she knew she had only minutes before the white settlers would emerge from their buildings and spot her. At 12 years old, Ayanna had learned to move like a shadow. Her bare feet made no sound on the packed earth as she crept toward the row of trash barrels behind the general store. The shame burned in her chest worse than the hunger in her belly, but survival had taught her that pride was a luxury she could not afford. Her people, the Chiricahua Apache, had been scattered like seeds in a windstorm after the last failed uprising. Her father had died fighting the Bluecoats at Apache Pass, and her mother had succumbed to the white man's spotted sickness the following winter. Ayanna had been alone for 8 months now, surviving on her wits, her speed, and whatever scraps she could find. The first barrel yielded nothing but rotted vegetables and broken glass. Her hands, already scarred from previous searches, moved carefully through the refuse. In the second barrel, she found half a loaf of bread, hard as stone but still edible if soaked in water. Her heart leaped with relief, but she forced herself to keep searching. Winter was coming, and every morsel might mean the difference between life and death. As she reached deep into the third barrel, her fingers closed around something unexpected. It was a small cloth pouch, heavy with what felt like coins. Ayanna's breath caught in her throat. She had never stolen anything beyond food, and even that felt like betraying everything her parents had taught her about Apache honor. But the weight of the pouch in her palm spoke of possibilities, real food, perhaps a blanket, maybe even a knife to help her hunt. She was so focused on her internal struggle that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching behind her. It wasn't until a shadow fell across the barrel that she realized she was no longer alone. Her body tensed, ready to run, but a low voice spoke in perfect Apache, stopping her cold. "Stay silent. Follow me." Ayanna's blood turned to ice water. She had been caught by a white settler before and beaten for her troubles. But this voice spoke her language with the authority of someone born to it. Slowly, she turned around, still clutching the bread and the pouch. The man standing before her defied every expectation. He was tall and lean, with the weathered skin of someone who had spent his life under the desert sun. His hair hung in 2 long braids decorated with eagle feathers and silver ornaments. Most striking were his eyes, dark as obsidian and holding secrets that seemed older than the mountains themselves. He wore a mix of traditional Apache clothing and items clearly taken from defeated enemies: buckskin leggings, a blue cavalry shirt with sergeant stripes, and a gun belt that had once belonged to a Texas Ranger. But it was the scars that told his real story. 3 parallel lines ran down his left cheek, the mark of a bear's claws. A bullet scar puckered the skin above his collarbone. His hands, she noticed, were covered in small cuts and burns, the evidence of countless battles and survival tests. This was no ordinary Apache warrior. "I know who you are, Ayanna, daughter of Thunder Horse," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew your father. He died well." The mention of her father's name hit her like a physical blow. Thunder Horse had been her world, the strongest and bravest man she had ever known. Hearing his name spoken with such respect by this stranger brought tears she had been holding back for months. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper back. "I am called Mano Roja by those who fear me. Red Hand. But, you may call me Nailnish, for that is the name your father knew." He paused, studying her face with those penetrating eyes. "I have been watching you for 3 days, little one. Watching you survive when stronger people have given up and died. Watching you maintain your honor even when hunger drives you to desperation." Nailnish stepped closer, and Ayana could see more details that marked him as someone truly formidable. A necklace made from bear claws and enemy bullets hung around his neck. His rifle, she noticed, was not the standard military issue carried by most Apache warriors, but a specialized sharpshooter's weapon, clearly taken from someone very skilled and very dangerous. "The bread you have taken will keep you alive for perhaps 2 days," he continued. "The coins in that pouch might buy you a week's worth of food if you spend them carefully. But, what I offer you will keep you alive for a lifetime, and perhaps allow you to help your people survive what is coming." "What is coming?" Ayana asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "The end of the old ways. The whites will not stop until every Apache is dead or locked away on their reservations. Most of our people believe they can still fight this war the way their grandfathers did. They are wrong. The world has changed, and we must change with it or die." He gestured toward the settlement around them. "You have learned something in these past months that many warriors twice your age refuse to understand. Sometimes survival requires doing things that feel like betrayal of everything you believe. Sometimes the greatest honor comes from actions that bring immediate shame." Nailnish reached into his own pouch and pulled out a small piece of jerky, offering it to her. The meat was perfectly seasoned and obviously high quality, not the emergency rations most Apache carried. But there is a difference between surviving and thriving, between merely lasting another day and becoming strong enough to shape your own destiny. Ayana took the jerky gratefully, but her mind was racing. Everything about this man suggested he was exactly what he appeared to be, a Apache war leader of legendary status. But what would such a man want with a starving girl reduced to digging through garbage? "I don't understand," she said. "Why would you want to help me? I'm nobody important." "Nobody important?" Nailnish's laugh was like the sound of wind through canyon rocks, carrying both warmth and an edge of danger. "Child, you have survived 8 months alone in a world that kills grown warriors in 8 days. You speak Apache, Spanish, and enough English to trade for supplies. You move through white settlements without being caught, gather information without being suspected, and maintain your dignity even when forced into desperate circumstances." He pointed to the trading post behind them. "Do you know what I see when I look at that building? I see a fortress that holds supplies my people need, defended by men with rifles and a location that controls access to the only reliable water source for 50 miles. Do you know what you see when you look at it?" Ayana glanced back at the building, trying to understand what he meant. "I see the place where Mr. Henderson keeps the good food locked up, where Mrs. Henderson hangs the laundry on Tuesdays, and where their son Billy likes to sneak out at night to meet that Mexican girl from the cantina." "Exactly." Nailnish's eyes gleamed with approval. "You see the human details that turn an impossible target into a manageable problem. That is a gift, little one, and it is exactly what I need." The sound of voices from the trading post made them both freeze. The settlement was waking up, and soon the area would be crawling with people who would not look kindly on finding an Apache warrior and a known thief talking behind their buildings. "We need to leave," Nailnish said. "But, first, you must make a choice. You can take that bread and those coins and continue as you have been, surviving day by day until hunger or cold or bad luck finally claims you. Or you can come with me and learn to be something more than just another casualty of this war. What would you teach me? Ayanna asked, though she had already made her decision. Anything was better than slowly starving to death alone. I will teach you to fight like an Apache, but think like your enemy. I will teach you to use your size and their assumptions against them. I will teach you to gather information, to move unseen through enemy territory, and to strike at targets they never see coming. His voice dropped even lower. Most importantly, I will teach you to survive not just as an individual, but as part of something larger than yourself. The sound of a door opening echoed from the front of the trading post. They were out of time. Choose now, daughter of Thunder Horse. Follow the path of safety that leads to certain death, or follow me into danger that might lead to life worth living. Ayanna looked down at the bread in her hands, then, at the mysterious warrior who offered her something she had thought lost forever, hope. The choice was simpler than it appeared. She had been dying slowly for months. If she was going to die anyway, she might as well die trying to become someone her father would be proud of. She tucked the bread into her shirt and dropped the coin pouch back into the trash barrel. Whatever Nailnish planned to teach her, it would begin with honor, not theft. I will follow, she whispered. Nailnish nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both approval and the gravity of what she had just committed to. Without another word, he turned and began moving toward the edge of the settlement, his step so silent that even watching him, Ayanna could barely hear his movement. As she followed him into the desert morning, Ayanna felt the first stirrings of something she had almost forgotten existed, excitement for the future. She had no idea what trials awaited her, no understanding of the legendary figure she was following, and no concept of the role she would one day play in the final, desperate attempts of her people to remain free. All she knew was that for the first time in 8 months, she was no longer alone, and the path ahead led somewhere other than slow starvation. Behind them, the settlement of Tucson continued its daily routine, unaware that they had just witnessed the beginning of a partnership that would become the stuff of legend and nightmare, depending on which side of the conflict you found yourself on. The Apache girl who had been reduced to searching through garbage was about to begin her transformation into something far more dangerous, a weapon forged from desperation, tempered by loss, and sharpened by the wisdom of one of the most cunning warriors her people had ever produced. The hidden camp lay nestled in a box canyon so perfectly concealed that Ayanna would never have found it even if she had searched for years. Nailnish had led her through a maze of rock formations, false trails, and seemingly impassable barriers, each one designed to discourage or confuse potential enemies. The final approach required crawling through a narrow cave tunnel that opened suddenly, into a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering red stone walls. What she found there challenged everything she thought she knew about Apache warfare and survival. The camp housed perhaps 30 people, but they were unlike any Apache band she had ever seen. There were warriors from different tribes, including several Mescalero and even 2 Navajo who nodded respectfully to Nailnish as they passed. There were Mexican vaqueros who had deserted their employers, a former Buffalo soldier who had abandoned the army, and, most surprisingly, 3 white men who wore Apache clothing and spoke the language fluently. Your people? Ayanna asked, gesturing toward the diverse group. My people are those who understand that the old divisions no longer matter, Nailnish replied. The whites see no difference between Chiricahua and Mescalero, between Apache and Navajo, between those who fight and those who seek peace. To them, we are all simply obstacles to be removed. So I have gathered those who are willing to set aside ancient grudges in favor of survival. As they walked through the camp, Ayanna observed details that spoke of careful organization and unusual resources. The weapons were not the hodgepodge collection typical of Apache bands, but uniform, well-maintained rifles of the latest design. The horses were clearly chosen for speed and endurance rather than simply taken from the nearest raid. Most telling of all, there were maps. Detailed, hand-drawn charts of the entire territory, marked with military positions, patrol routes, supply lines, and what appeared to be detailed intelligence about individual commanders and their habits. This is not just a war band, she realized aloud. Very good, Nailnish smiled, the expression making his scarred face almost gentle. This is a school. And you, daughter of Thunder Horse, are my newest student. The next 3 months would prove to be the most challenging and transformative of Ayana's young life. Nailnish's training methods defied every expectation and tradition she had grown up with. Instead of beginning with weapons training or horseback riding, he started with something far more fundamental, understanding her enemy. Sit, he commanded on her first morning, gesturing to a spot beside a small fire where several other new recruits had gathered. Before you can defeat an enemy, you must understand how they think. And the first step in understanding how whites think is learning to see yourself as they see you. He held up a small mirror, a luxury item clearly taken from some raided settlement. Look at yourself, Ayana. What do you see? I see a girl, she answered, confused by the simplicity of the question. Wrong. You see what you have been taught to see by people who love you. Now look again, but, this time, see yourself through the eyes of a white settler, a cavalry officer, or a territorial governor. What do they see? Ayana stared at her reflection, trying to shift her perspective. It was harder than she had expected. They see a savage? More specific. What kind of savage? What does your age tell them? Your gender? Your obvious hunger and poverty? Gradually, under Nailnish's patient questioning, she began to understand. To white eyes, she was not a threat but a nuisance. Not a warrior but a beggar. Not someone to fear but someone to pity or, at best, ignore. It was a revelation that stung worse than any physical blow, but also opened possibilities she had never considered. Your greatest weapon, Nailnish explained, is their certainty that you are harmless. A hungry Apache girl searching for food confirms everything they believe about the superiority of their civilization and the pitiable state of the noble savage. They will see you as evidence of their own righteousness, not as a threat to their security. The training that followed built upon this foundation in ways that challenged every traditional Apache value. Instead of learning to be a proud warrior who faced enemies directly, Ayana learned to be a ghost who achieved victory through subtlety and misdirection. She learned to alter her appearance and manner to become nearly invisible in white settlements. With her hair styled differently and wearing clothes taken from the supplies of a captured wagon train, she could pass for a Mexican servant girl or even a young settler of mixed heritage. More importantly, she learned to adopt the mannerisms and speech patterns that made whites comfortable around her, allowing her to move through their communities gathering information that no traditional war party could ever hope to obtain. The warrior's path demands that you announce your presence and prove your courage through direct confrontation, Nailnish taught her during one evening lesson. But the survivor's path requires that you accomplish your goals without your enemies ever knowing you were there. Both have their place, but, in this war, the survivor's path is more valuable than the warrior's. Physical training was equally unconventional. Instead of focusing on traditional weapons like the bow or lance, Nailnish emphasized knives, small firearms that could be easily concealed, and, most importantly, the use of common tools as weapons. A sewing needle could be more deadly than an arrow if properly employed. A cooking pot could be a better weapon than a war club in the right circumstances. The key was learning to see weapons where others saw only harmless objects. The whites have better guns, more ammunition, and superior numbers, he explained while teaching her to use a simple wooden spoon as a striking weapon. But they also have expectations about what constitutes a threat. An Apache warrior with a rifle is obviously dangerous. A servant girl carrying kitchen utensils is beneath notice. That moment of dismissal is when you strike. But, perhaps the most valuable skill she learned was intelligence gathering. Under the tutelage of Thomas Running Bear, a Chiricahua warrior who had spent 2 years working as a translator for the army before deserting with vital military secrets, Ayanna learned to listen for information that could save Apache lives or provide opportunities for successful raids. She learned that seemingly casual conversations between soldiers revealed patrol schedules, supply deliveries, and weaknesses in fort defenses. She discovered that the wives of officers often knew more about military strategy than they realized, and would share that information freely with someone they perceived as a harmless domestic servant. Most importantly, she learned to read the signs of moral and tactical changes in the white community that might signal new threats or opportunities. Information is more valuable than gold, Thomas taught her. A warrior with perfect knowledge of enemy movements can defeat 10 warriors who fight blind. A leader who understands the true strength and intentions of their opponents can achieve victory even when heavily outnumbered. The practical applications came sooner than expected. 6 weeks into her training, Nailnish announced that she would accompany him on her first real mission. The target was Fort Bowie, the military installation that controlled access to Apache Pass and posed the greatest threat to Apache movements in the region. "Your job is not to fight," he emphasized as they prepared to depart. "Your job is to observe, to listen, and to report. You will enter the fort as exactly what you appear to be, a hungry girl seeking work. You will offer to help in the kitchens, the laundry, anywhere they will allow you access. And, while you work, you will see everything and remember everything." The mission began before dawn, with Ayanna altering her appearance using techniques she had learned during training. Her hair was braided in the style favored by Mexican girls, her clothes were the simple cotton dress of a servant, and her entire manner was transformed from the proud bearing of an Apache to the humble deference expected of the conquered. The transformation was so complete that when she approached the fort's main gate, the sentries barely glanced at her. To them, she was just another example of the defeated Indians seeking charity from their white benefactors. The contempt in their eyes stung, but she had learned to use such emotions as fuel rather than distraction. Inside the fort, she found work exactly as Nailnish had predicted. The post commander's wife, a kindly woman named Mrs. Morrison who saw helping poor Indian children as her Christian duty, immediately put Ayanna to work helping with the laundry and kitchen duties. The work was hard, but it provided perfect cover for observation. Over the course of 3 days, Ayanna learned things that would have taken a war party weeks of dangerous scouting to discover. She learned that the garrison was expecting a supply convoy carrying not only food and ammunition, but also gold intended to pay the local Apache scouts who had agreed to track down hostile bands. She discovered that 2 of the fort's defensive cannons were out of commission due to a shortage of replacement parts. Most importantly, she overheard a conversation between officers that revealed the planned route and timing of a major patrol that would leave the fort vulnerable for nearly a week. But the real test came on her 3rd day, when she encountered someone who could have destroyed everything in an instant. She was hanging laundry behind the officers' quarters when she heard a familiar voice speaking in rapid Spanish to one of the Mexican cooks. The speaker was Miguel Santos, a man she recognized as a former scout for her father's band who had switched sides after the defeat at Apache Pass. If he recognized her, he would certainly report her presence to the fort commander. Her heart pounding, Ayanna forced herself to continue hanging clothes while thinking frantically. Running would guarantee discovery. Standing still might allow Santos to study her face long enough to penetrate her disguise. But Nailnish had taught her that the most dangerous moments often presented the greatest opportunities. Instead of avoiding Santos, she deliberately walked toward him, carrying a basket of wet clothes and adopting the manner of a servant girl eager to please. When she reached the area where he was talking with the cook, she stumbled slightly, dropping several items from her basket. "Oh, perdón," she exclaimed in Spanish, immediately dropping to gather the scattered laundry. Santos glanced at her with the casual indifference of a man accustomed to being served by women. But, as she knelt there, seemingly focused on collecting the dropped items, she was actually listening to his conversation with intense concentration. What she heard made her blood run cold. "The Apache are planning something," Santos was saying. My contacts in the reservation tell me that too many young men have disappeared from the camps. Colonel Morrison needs to increase patrols in the Dragoon Mountains. There's a new war leader gathering followers, someone they call Red Hand. The cook, a cheerful Mexican woman named Rosa, made a dismissive gesture. These Apache are always planning something. It never amounts to anything serious. This is different, Santos insisted. Red Hand is not like the other war chiefs. He's smart, educated. He fights like a white man but thinks like an Apache. The army is going to have to change its tactics if they want to catch him. As Ayanna listened, she realized that Santos represented both a terrible danger and an incredible opportunity. He was actively gathering intelligence about Nailnish's operations, but he was also clearly trusted by the fort's leadership. If she could find a way to feed him false information, it might be possible to mislead the entire army about Nailnish's true intentions and capabilities. The plan that formed in her mind was audacious and dangerous, but it followed perfectly the lessons she had learned about using enemy assumptions against them. That evening, as she finished her kitchen duties, she deliberately lingered near the area where Santos usually spent his evenings drinking and gambling with the other scouts and camp followers. When she was certain he was watching, she carefully dropped a small piece of paper near his table, then continued on her way without appearing to notice her mistake. The paper contained information written in her father's hand, information that was absolutely accurate but completely useless, the location of an old Apache camp that had been abandoned for months. The next morning, she watched with satisfaction as Santos presented the discovered intelligence to Colonel Morrison with great fanfare. The colonel, impressed by what appeared to be a major intelligence breakthrough, immediately ordered a patrol to investigate the abandoned campsite. The patrol would find evidence of Apache presence, just as the paper promised, but they would also waste valuable time and resources chasing ghosts while Nailnish's real activities continued elsewhere. It was a small victory, but it proved to Ayanna that the tactics Nailnish was teaching her could work against even the most dangerous opponents. More importantly, it showed her that she had the temperament and intelligence to become something far more valuable than just another warrior in the endless cycle of raids and revenge that had characterized Apache resistance up to this point. When she finally departed Fort Bowie, she carried with her detailed intelligence about military strength, patrol schedules, supply routes, and defensive weaknesses. But she also carried something more valuable, proof that an Apache girl could move freely among her people's enemies, gathering information and sowing confusion without ever being suspected. The journey back to the hidden canyon gave her time to reflect on what she had learned and experienced. 3 months earlier, she had been a desperate child reduced to searching through garbage for survival. Now she was becoming something entirely new, a weapon disguised as harmlessness, a warrior who fought with information and misdirection rather than arrows and bullets. As the familiar red rocks of Nailnish's stronghold came into view, Ayanna realized that she was no longer the same person who had followed him out of Tucson. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid for something unprecedented in Apache history, a female operative capable of moving unseen through white society while serving the cause of her people's survival. What she didn't yet understand was that Nailnish's plans for her development were only beginning, and that the skills she had learned at Fort Bowie would soon be tested in situations far more dangerous and complex than anything she could imagine. The autumn winds brought more than just cooler weather to the hidden canyon. They carried news that would test everything Ayanna had learned and force her to confront the true cost of the path she had chosen. A messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgency. The news he brought would challenge not only her growing skills but her fundamental understanding of loyalty, honor, and survival. General Crook has returned to Arizona Territory, the messenger reported to the assembled war council. He brings with him 300 Apache scouts from the San Carlos Reservation, led by war chiefs who have sworn to hunt down every free Apache still in the mountains. The impact of this announcement rippled through the council like a stone thrown into still water. Apache hunting Apache was not unprecedented, but the scale of Crook's new campaign represented something far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. These scouts would know every hiding place, every escape route, every survival technique that had allowed the free Apache to evade capture for so long. Nailnish listened to the report with his characteristic calm, but Ayanna could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his hand unconsciously moved to rest on his knife handle. When the messenger finished speaking, the camp fell into a silence heavy with implications. They are offering substantial rewards for information leading to the capture of resistance leaders, the messenger continued. $50 in gold for any Warchief, dead or alive. $100 for Red Hand specifically. Several warriors exchanged glances at this news. Even among Apache, $50 represented more wealth than most would see in several years. For people living on the edge of starvation, such sums represented powerful temptation. There is more, the messenger added reluctantly. Crook has authorized the Apache scouts to offer amnesty to any resistance fighters who surrender voluntarily. Full pardons, guaranteed safety, and permanent settlement on the reservation with their families. Now the silence became absolute. Every person in the council understood what this meant. For the first time, surrender offered genuine hope of survival rather than certain execution. For warriors who had lost everything fighting the white man's expansion, the possibility of seeing their wives and children again, of living without the constant threat of death or capture, represented almost overwhelming temptation. "How long do we have?" Nailnish asked. "The advance scouts are already in the field. The main force will arrive within 2 weeks. They know about this canyon. Miguel Santos has provided them with detailed maps of all our known hideouts." Ayanna felt her stomach clench at the mention of Santos. Her clever manipulation of intelligence at Fort Bowie had apparently been discovered, turning a former asset into an active enemy. She had learned a valuable lesson about the dangerous game of deception. Every success created new risks, and enemies who discovered they had been fooled became twice as dangerous. "We need to evacuate immediately," declared James Wolfkiller, one of Nailnish's most trusted lieutenants. "Scatter into small groups, avoid contact until we can regroup somewhere safer." "There is nowhere safer," Nailnish replied quietly. "Crook's Apache scouts know this country as well as we do. They know our traditional hiding places, our water sources, our seasonal camping grounds. Running will only delay our capture, not prevent it." The despair in the council was palpable. These were seasoned fighters who had survived countless battles and raids, but they understood that this new threat represented something qualitatively different. Fighting cavalry units composed of men unfamiliar with Apache tactics was one thing. Fighting Apache who knew those tactics intimately was something else entirely. "Then we fight," growled Bear Claw, a massive Mescalero warrior whose scars told the story of dozens of battles. "Better to die as warriors than live as prisoners." "And accomplish what?" Nailnish challenged. "Dead warriors protect no one and free no one. If we fight Crook's scouts in traditional battle, we will lose. They have superior numbers, better supplies, and knowledge equal to our own. We need a different approach." Ayanna had been listening to this debate with growing unease, not because she disagreed with any particular position, but because she sensed that everyone was missing something crucial. The intelligence-gathering skills she had developed made her instinctively look for details others might overlook, and something about this situation felt incomplete. "The amnesty offer," she said suddenly, interrupting the debate. "What exactly does it promise?" The messenger looked at her with surprise. In traditional Apache councils, young women did not speak unless specifically asked for their opinion. But Nailnish had made it clear that his war band operated by different rules, and her question was clearly relevant. Full pardons for past actions, guaranteed safety from prosecution or retaliation, permanent settlement rights on the reservation, and reunification with family members already living there, the messenger recited. "And what does it require in exchange?" Ayanna pressed. Voluntary surrender within 30 days, full cooperation with military authorities, and... The messenger hesitated, disclosure of information about other resistance groups still in the field. Now the true nature of Crook's strategy became clear. The amnesty was not simply an attempt to end the fighting through mercy. It was a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation designed to turn surrendering fighters into sources of information about those who remained free. Every Apache who accepted amnesty would be questioned extensively about locations, plans, and weaknesses of groups like Nailnish's band. "It's a trap," Wolf Killer said grimly. "They're not offering amnesty, they're recruiting spies." "More than that," Nailnish added thoughtfully. "They're forcing us to choose between abandoning our people and endangering them. Anyone who surrenders to protect their own life becomes a weapon that threatens everyone who remains free." But Ayanna was thinking beyond the immediate tactical implications. The amnesty offer represented something else, an opportunity. If Crook's strategy depended on intelligence from surrendering Apache, then, controlling that intelligence could be the key to survival. What if someone did surrender, she asked carefully. Not to actually cooperate, but to mislead them? To feed them false information while gathering intelligence about their operations? The suggestion created an immediate uproar. Several warriors shouted their outrage at what they saw as cowardice disguised as strategy. Even those who understood the potential value of the idea were disturbed by its implications. "You're talking about betraying our deepest values," Bear Claw growled. "Apache do not deceive their way out of honorable combat. We face our enemies directly or we die trying. Our enemies don't share that value," Ayanna replied with heat. "They use every advantage they can find, including turning our honor against us. Santos was Apache once, and now he leads them to our camps. Why should we handicap ourselves with rules they don't follow? Because without those rules, we become exactly what they claim we are," Wolf Killer said quietly. "Savages without honor or principle." The debate that followed was unlike anything Ayanna had ever witnessed. It touched on fundamental questions about Apache identity, the nature of honor in warfare, and the acceptable costs of survival. Some warriors argued that dying with honor was preferable to living with shame. Others contended that survival of the people was more important than preservation of abstract principles. Nailnish listened to all perspectives without taking sides, but Ayanna could see him evaluating not just the strategic merits of various proposals, but their psychological impact on his followers. A war leader who pushed his people too far from their traditional values risked losing their loyalty even if his tactics were successful. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, Nailnish called for silence. "The decision is mine to make," he said with quiet authority. "But, before I make it, I want to hear from someone whose perspective we have not yet considered." He turned to look directly at Ayanna. "You have lived among the whites. You understand how they think and what they value. If you were in General Crook's position, what would you most want to know about our operations?" The question put Ayanna in an uncomfortable spotlight, but she forced herself to think analytically rather than emotionally. Her time at Fort Bowie had taught her to see situations from multiple perspectives, and this skill was exactly what Nailnish was asking her to employ. "He would want to know 3 things above all else," she said finally. "First, the location of our main stronghold and any backup camps. Second, the size and composition of our forces, including how many fighters we actually have and what weapons we possess. Third, our future plans, particularly whether we intend to continue raiding or are preparing for some larger action. And what would happen if he received accurate information about all 3 areas?" Nailnish pressed. "He would move immediately to surround and capture us. With Apache scouts guiding him, he could probably accomplish it with minimal casualties to his own forces." She paused, then added, "But what if the information he received was carefully crafted to be believable but wrong?" Now she could see that several council members were beginning to understand where her thoughts were leading. If Crook's strategy depended on intelligence from surrendering Apache, then, that same dependence could become a vulnerability if the intelligence was deliberately misleading. "You're proposing to volunteer as bait," Nailnish said. It was not a question. "I'm proposing to volunteer as a weapon," Ayanna corrected. "My greatest advantage has always been that enemies underestimate me." A hungry Apache girl seeking amnesty would be exactly what Crook expects to see. He would question me extensively, but he would also assume that someone my age couldn't possibly know anything truly important. The idea was audacious and dangerous, but it followed logically from everything she had learned about intelligence warfare. If she could convince Crook's interrogators that she was a minor member of a much smaller and less threatening group than Nailnish actually led, it might buy them time to either escape or prepare for battle on more favorable terms. "And if you're caught in the deception?" Wolf Killer asked. "If they discover you're feeding them false information?" "Then, I die," Ayanna said simply. "But, if I do nothing, we all die anyway. At least this way, my death might serve a purpose." The bluntness of her response seemed to settle something in the council. Warriors who had been arguing about honor and principles suddenly found themselves confronting the practical reality of their situation. They were facing an enemy who understood their methods and culture intimately. Traditional approaches to resistance were unlikely to succeed. "There is wisdom in the girl's proposal," admitted an elderly war chief named Stone Bear, whose opinion carried significant weight due to his years of experience. "Sometimes the greatest courage lies not in facing death directly, but in accepting a mission that requires you to live with consequences worse than death." After another hour of debate, Nailnish announced his decision. "Ayanna will carry out this mission, but not alone. I will arrange for 3 other volunteers to surrender at different times and locations, each carrying slightly different versions of false intelligence. If one is discovered, the others may still succeed. If all are discovered, we will be no worse off than we are now." The plan that emerged from the subsequent discussion was complex and risky, but it represented their best chance of turning Crook's intelligence strategy against itself. Ayanna would surrender first, presenting herself as a minor figure with limited knowledge. Her false information would suggest that Nailnish's band consisted of no more than 15 warriors operating from a temporary camp in the Chiricahua Mountains. 2 days later, a Mescalero warrior named Swift Arrow would surrender separately, claiming to be from a different group entirely. His story would corroborate some elements of Ayanna's information while adding details about fictional supply caches and escape routes designed to draw search parties away from Nailnish's true location. Finally, Wolf Killer himself would surrender, claiming to be a disillusioned follower seeking amnesty after becoming convinced that continued resistance was hopeless. As Nailnish's apparent second-in-command, his testimony would carry the most weight, making his false intelligence about future plans and hidden weapons particularly credible. The next 3 days were spent in intensive preparation. Ayanna had to memorize not only her own false story, but enough details about the fictional scenarios her confederates would present to ensure their accounts would support each other without appearing rehearsed. She also had to prepare herself psychologically for the reality of what she was about to attempt. "Remember," Nailnish told her during their final private conversation, "your greatest protection lies in their assumptions about what an Apache girl your age could know or accomplish. Do not try to seem ignorant, but do not reveal the true extent of your training either. Let them discover just enough intelligence to feel successful while missing the information that could truly harm us." As dawn broke on her departure day, Ayanna found herself experiencing a complex mixture of fear and anticipation. Everything she had learned during her months of training had been leading to this moment, but the stakes were higher than anything she had previously faced. The journey to the designated surrender point took most of the day. As she traveled, she forced herself to think beyond the immediate mission to its potential consequences. Success would likely save Nailnish's band, but it would also mean accepting permanent separation from the only family she had known since her parents' death. Failure would mean death, but might also compromise the safety of everyone she cared about. By evening, she could see the lights of Camp Apache in the distance. Tomorrow, she would walk into that military installation and attempt to convince some of the most experienced Indian fighters in the army that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a frightened girl seeking mercy from forces too powerful to resist. What she could not know was that her mission would succeed beyond anyone's expectations, but that success would come at a personal cost that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The morning mist still clung to the valley floor when Ayanna approached the gates of Camp Apache with her hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face maintained the expression of resigned defeat that she had practiced during the long journey from Nailnish's canyon. Everything about her appearance had been carefully calculated to reinforce the story she was about to tell. Her clothes were torn and dirty, suggesting weeks of desperate flight through the mountains. Her hair hung loose and unkempt, abandoning the neat braids that marked an Apache girl's pride in her appearance. Most importantly, her eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had been pushed beyond their limits and seen too much suffering. It was not entirely an act. The past year had genuinely marked her in ways that no amount of training could completely erase. The sentries at the main gate reacted exactly as she had hoped. Their initial alertness faded quickly when they saw what appeared to be just another beaten Apache seeking refuge. One of them, a young soldier who looked barely older than herself, actually seemed sympathetic as he called for the officer of the day. Another one wanting amnesty, he told his companion. "Poor little thing looks half-starved." Lieutenant Morrison, the post commander's nephew who had recently arrived from West Point, appeared within minutes. His clean uniform and soft hands marked him as someone still new to frontier warfare, exactly the type of officer most likely to underestimate a surrendering Apache girl. "I am told you wish to surrender," he said in careful Spanish, apparently assuming she spoke no English. "Yes, senor," Ayanna replied in the same language, deliberately making her accent thicker than necessary. "I am tired of running. Tired of being hungry. I want to go to the reservation and live in peace." Morrison nodded with satisfaction, clearly pleased with what he saw as another victory for civilized values over savage resistance. "What is your name, child?" "Ayanna," she replied truthfully. There was no point in lying about something that could be easily verified, and using her real name would make the rest of her story more believable. "And which band were you traveling with?" "The Band of Red Hand," she said, allowing a tremor to enter her voice. "But it is broken now. Too many soldiers, too many Apache scouts hunting us. Most of the warriors are dead or captured." This was the crucial moment. Everything depended on Morrison's reaction to the mention of Nailnish's name. If he pressed too hard for immediate details, or if he seemed suspicious of her knowledge, the entire plan could collapse before it had properly begun. But Morrison's eyes lit up with excitement rather than suspicion. A surrender from Red Hand's band represented exactly the kind of intelligence coup that could advance a young officer's career. He immediately ordered her brought inside and provided with food and water while he arranged for a proper interrogation. The meal they gave her was the first substantial food she had eaten in 3 days, part of the preparation necessary to make her appear genuinely desperate. As she ate, she listened carefully to the conversations around her, gathering information that might prove useful later while maintaining the appearance of a frightened girl focused only on immediate survival. The formal questioning began that afternoon in the post commander's office. Colonel Morrison, the commander himself, had taken personal charge of the interrogation, bringing with him a translator and a stenographer to record every detail. Also present was Captain John Burke, who Ayanna recognized from intelligence reports as Crook's primary specialist in Apache affairs. "Tell us about Red Hand's band," Colonel Morrison began without preamble. "How many warriors, where they camp, what their plans are?" "I do not know much about such things," Ayanna replied carefully. "I am just a girl. The warriors do not talk about important matters when children are present." "But, you must have seen things," Burke pressed. "How many men were in the band? What weapons did they carry?" This was where her careful preparation became crucial. She had to provide enough information to seem cooperative while avoiding details that could genuinely harm Nailnish's operations. The fictional scenario she had memorized was designed to satisfy their expectations while misleading their strategic planning. "Maybe 15 men," she said after appearing to think carefully. "Some old, some young. They had rifles, but not very many bullets. Always we had to be careful not to waste ammunition." She watched the officers' faces carefully as she spoke. 15 fighters represented a significant but manageable threat, large enough to explain Red Hand's reputation but small enough to suggest that capture was achievable with reasonable effort. The detail about limited ammunition reinforced the impression of a desperate group on the verge of collapse. "Where did this band make its camps?" Morrison asked. "In the Chiricahua Mountains, near the old Apache stronghold at Cochisa's Rock." This was partially true. Nailnish had maintained a secondary camp in that area, though it had been abandoned weeks ago. "But, we moved often." Red Hand said the soldiers were getting too close. Burke leaned forward with interest. Did Red Hand ever speak of future plans? Raids he intended to make? Other bands he planned to join? "He talked about going to Mexico," Ayanna said, allowing uncertainty to creep into her voice. "He said there was no future for Apache in Arizona, that we should cross the border and join the Apache living in the Sierra Madre." This was perhaps the most important lie she would tell. If Burke believed that Nailnish was planning to flee to Mexico rather than continue fighting in Arizona, it might reduce the urgency of the search efforts and draw resources away from the territory where the band actually operated. The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours, with Burke and Morrison probing every aspect of her story while she maintained the careful balance between cooperation and ignorance. She provided details about daily life in the band that added authenticity to her account while avoiding anything that could reveal the true scope of Nailnish's operations or the sophistication of his intelligence network. By the end of the session, both officers seemed satisfied with what they had learned. A Apache band of 15 warriors planning to flee to Mexico represented a manageable problem that could be resolved through systematic patrolling of the border region. More importantly, her apparent willingness to cooperate suggested that other members of the band might be persuaded to surrender as well. "You have been very helpful, Ayanna," Colonel Morrison said with genuine warmth. "We will arrange for you to be transported to the San Carlos Reservation where you can live safely with other Apache families." The mention of San Carlos sent a genuine chill through her. The reservation was notorious for its harsh conditions and brutal treatment of its inhabitants. Thousands of Apache had been forced to live there in poverty and despair, dependent on inadequate government rations and subject to constant surveillance by military guards. For someone accustomed to the freedom of the mountains, San Carlos represented a kind of living death. But she had known this would be the price of her mission's success. She nodded gratefully, maintaining the pretense that reservation life represented salvation rather than imprisonment. That evening, as she waited in a holding cell for transportation to San Carlos, Ayanna reflected on the events of the day. The interrogation had gone better than she had dared hope. Burke and Morrison had accepted her story completely, asking no questions that she couldn't answer and showing no suspicion about the information she had provided. More importantly, she had learned valuable intelligence about military operations in the region. Burke had mentioned plans to increase patrols along the Mexican border, confirming that her false information about Nailnish's intentions had been believed. Morrison had referred to a upcoming supply convoy that would be lightly guarded due to the assumption that most Apache bands were either captured or fleeing south. But, as the hours passed, she found herself struggling with unexpected emotions. The success of her deception meant permanent separation from Nailnish and the only life she had known since her parents' death. She would spend the rest of her days on the reservation, watching her people slowly lose their identity and spirit under the crushing weight of enforced dependency. The arrival of other Apache prisoners the next day brought both comfort and new complications. Among them was an elderly woman named Maria Antelope, who had been captured during a recent raid. Maria immediately recognized Ayanna as Thunder Horse's daughter, despite the months that had passed since their last meeting. "Child, what are you doing here?" Maria whispered in Apache during a moment when the guards were distracted. "Your father would weep to see his daughter surrendering to these people." Ayana's throat constricted with emotion, but she forced herself to maintain her cover. "I had no choice, grandmother. There was nowhere else to go. But, surely Red Hand would have protected you. He was your father's friend, and he has never been defeated in battle." The conversation was dangerous territory. If Maria continued to speak about Nailnish as a current active threat rather than the leader of a broken band fleeing to Mexico, it could undermine everything Ayana had accomplished. She had to find a way to silence the older woman without arousing suspicion among the guards or other prisoners. "Red Hand is dead," she lied, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "He was killed in a fight with Apache scouts 3 weeks ago. The band scattered after that." Maria's face crumpled with grief at this news, but she asked no more questions. The lie had served its purpose, but it had also forced Ayana to confront the full cost of her chosen role. She was not just deceiving her enemies, she was lying to her own people about the fate of their greatest remaining war leader. The journey to San Carlos took 4 days, during which Ayana had ample opportunity to observe the other Apache prisoners and the soldiers guarding them. What she saw confirmed her worst expectations about reservation life. The prisoners were a mixture of genuine surrenders and captured fighters, but all shared the same defeated look of people who had given up hope. The soldiers, for their part, treated their charges with a mixture of contempt and indifference. They provided minimal food and water, showed no concern for the comfort of sick or elderly prisoners, and made it clear that they viewed Apache as subhuman obstacles to territorial development rather than as people deserving of basic dignity. When they finally reached San Carlos, the reality proved even worse than she had imagined. The reservation was a barren stretch of desert land unsuitable for farming or hunting, surrounded by mountains that might as well have been prison walls for all the freedom they represented. The Apache confined there lived in crude shelters that provided minimal protection from the elements, dependent on government rations that were often late, inadequate, or spoiled. But it was the spiritual atmosphere of the place that affected her most deeply. These were a people in the process of dying, not physically but culturally. Children who had never known freedom played listless games in the dust. Young men who should have been warriors sat idle, their purpose destroyed and their pride broken. Elders who carried the wisdom of generations watched helplessly as their traditions were forgotten and their stories went untold. Ayana was assigned to a barracks housing other single women and children. Her bunkmate was a girl named Rosa, perhaps 2 years younger than herself, who had been born on the reservation and knew no other life. Rosa's acceptance of their circumstances was perhaps more disturbing than open rebellion would have been. "You'll get used to it," Rosa told her matter-of-factly. "It's not so bad once you stop thinking about what you've lost. The soldiers don't bother you much if you do what they say and don't cause trouble." That night, lying on a thin mattress in a building that stank of too many people living too close together, Ayana felt the full weight of what she had sacrificed. She had saved Nailnish's band by condemning herself to this living death, trading her freedom for their continued ability to fight. But, as the days passed, she began to realize that her mission was far from over. The reservation was not just a prison for Apache, it was also a source of intelligence that could be invaluable to the resistance. The other inmates included former scouts who had worked with the military, traders who traveled throughout the territory, and refugees from dozens of different bands, each carrying information about military movements, supply routes, and political developments. More importantly, she discovered that communication with the outside world was not entirely impossible. A network of sympathetic traders, Mexican suppliers, and even some military personnel disillusioned with government policy provided channels through which information could be passed to Apache still fighting in the mountains. Within 2 weeks of her arrival at San Carlos, Ayana had begun constructing her own intelligence network among the reservation's population. Using the same skills Nailnish had taught her about observation and manipulation, she gradually identified prisoners who still harbored resistance sentiments and guards who might be susceptible to bribery or other forms of influence. Her first intelligence report, passed through a chain of contacts that included a sympathetic Mexican trader and 2 former Apache scouts, reached Nailnish's band within a month of her surrender. It contained detailed information about military patrol schedules, supply convoy routes, and planned operations against Apache still fighting in the field. But, perhaps most importantly, it confirmed that her deception had succeeded completely. Military intelligence files now listed Red Hand's band as destroyed or fled to Mexico, removing them from the list of immediate threats and allowing them to operate with reduced scrutiny. The success of her mission brought both satisfaction and a deeper understanding of the price she had agreed to pay. She had become a ghost among her own people, forced to maintain her cover even among those she most wanted to help. Every day brought new reminders of the life she had given up and the future she would never have. Yet as autumn turned to winter, and her intelligence network expanded to include contacts throughout the territory, Ayanna began to understand that her role in the resistance was far from over. She was no longer just a spy, she was becoming the nerve center of an intelligence operation that might ultimately prove more valuable than any individual war band. The Apache girl who had once searched through garbage for survival had found a new purpose, but it was one that required her to remain invisible even to those she served, forever watching and waiting while others lived the life of freedom she had sacrificed for their sake. 2 years had passed since Ayanna's surrender at Camp Apache, and the transformation of both the reservation and the broader conflict had been more dramatic than anyone could have predicted. What had begun as a desperate intelligence mission had evolved into something far more complex and far-reaching, a shadow war fought with information, influence, and carefully orchestrated deceptions that challenged every assumption about Apache resistance. The reservation itself had become Ayanna's theater of operations. To the casual observer, she appeared to be exactly what her official records claimed, a model prisoner who had adapted successfully to civilized life. She worked in the reservation school, teaching Apache children to read and write English while ostensibly helping them abandon their primitive heritage. She attended the mandatory Christian services and even participated in the women's sewing circles organized by the post commander's wife. But, beneath this facade of compliance, she had constructed an intelligence network that would have impressed even Nailnish. Her position in the school gave her access to children from dozens of different Apache families, each carrying fragments of information about relatives still fighting in the mountains. The sewing circles provided cover for conversations with women whose husbands worked as scouts or laborers for the military. Most importantly, her reputation for cooperation had earned her the trust of several reservation administrators who spoke freely in her presence about military operations and government policies. The intelligence she gathered flowed through carefully established channels to Apache fighters throughout the territory. Her network had grown to include sympathetic traders, disaffected soldiers, Mexican smugglers, and even a few government officials who had become disgusted with the brutality of federal Indian policy. The information they provided had saved dozens of Apache lives and enabled resistance groups to avoid capture while striking at vulnerable targets. But the true measure of her success lay in what had not happened. General Crook's massive campaign to eliminate Apache resistance had largely failed, not through dramatic military defeats, but through the steady erosion of intelligence and the systematic misdirection of military resources. Patrols sent to hunt Apache bands found only abandoned camps. Supply convoys took routes that avoided ambush sites they never knew existed. Military planning was based on intelligence reports that were accurate in every detail except the ones that mattered most. The broader conflict had evolved as well. Nailnish's band had not only survived but had become the nucleus of a new kind of resistance movement that drew inspiration from Ayanna's example. Instead of relying purely on traditional warfare, Apache fighters had begun to adopt some of the unconventional tactics she had pioneered. Young warriors learned to move through white settlements gathering intelligence. Women and children were trained to serve as couriers and safe house operators. Even elderly Apache contributed by spreading carefully crafted rumors designed to confuse enemy planning. The effectiveness of these new methods had forced the military to fundamentally reconsider their approach to the Apache problem. Traditional cavalry tactics proved useless against an enemy that often knew more about military operations than the officers conducting them. Attempts to use Apache scouts were increasingly frustrated by the discovery that many supposed allies were actually feeding information to the resistance. But, success had brought new dangers and moral complexities that Ayanna had not anticipated. Her dual life required constant vigilance and an ever-growing web of deceptions that threatened to consume her identity entirely. She had become so skilled at playing the role of the reformed Apache that sometimes she caught herself believing her own performance. More troubling were the genuine relationships she had formed with people on both sides of the conflict. Sarah Morrison, the post commander's daughter, had become a close friend who genuinely cared about Ayanna's welfare and future. Dr. Williams, the reservation physician, treated her with respect and kindness while working tirelessly to improve conditions for Apache patients. Even some of the soldiers had earned her reluctant admiration through their fair treatment of prisoners and their obvious discomfort with the harsher aspects of their duties. These relationships forced her to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of her enemies and the cost of her deceptions. The people she was lying to were not all monsters. Many were decent individuals trapped in a system they did not fully understand or control. Her intelligence gathering sometimes revealed information that could harm people who had shown her genuine kindness. Balancing her loyalty to the Apache cause against her growing understanding of individual white settlers' humanity became an increasingly difficult moral burden. The weight of these contradictions was made heavier by her complete isolation from her own people. The Apache on the reservation knew her only as Thunder Horse's daughter who had surrendered and adapted to white ways. They respected her memory of her father but had no idea of her current activities. Her few attempts to recruit assistance from other reservation Apache had failed, not because they lacked sympathy for the resistance, but because her cover was too perfect and her reputation for cooperation too well established. The turning point came during the winter of her third year on the reservation, when a message arrived through her network that would change everything. Nailnish was planning his most ambitious operation yet, a coordinated series of strikes designed to force the government to negotiate a genuine peace treaty rather than simply pursuing the elimination of all free Apache. The plan was brilliant in its scope and audacity. Simultaneous attacks on military supply depots throughout the territory would be timed to coincide with raids on several large ranches and mining operations. The goal was not maximum casualties but maximum economic disruption. By demonstrating that Apache forces could strike anywhere at any time, Nailnish hoped to convince territorial authorities that continued warfare was more expensive than negotiated settlement. But the success of the operation depended entirely on precise intelligence about military response capabilities and timing. Nailnish needed to know exact patrol schedules, the locations of reserve forces, and, most critically, the plans for any preemptive strikes that might be launched if the military detected signs of unusual Apache activity. The message requesting this information also contained something Ayanna had not seen for almost 3 years. A personal note from Nailnish himself. "Little sister," it read in Apache, "the path you chose has saved more Apache lives than any warrior's courage. But, the time is coming when your greatest test will arrive. Soon you must choose between the safety of your cover and the success of our people's final gamble for survival. I pray that when that moment comes, you will remember that some victories can only be achieved by those willing to sacrifice everything, including their own lives." The note both honored her contributions and warned her that maintaining her intelligence role might soon become impossible. If Nailnish's planned operation failed, the resulting military crackdown would almost certainly expose her network. If it succeeded, the peace negotiations that followed might render her position unnecessary. Either way, her years of careful preparation were building toward a climactic moment that would determine not only her own fate but the future of Apache resistance. The intelligence Nailnish needed required her to take unprecedented risks. Military patrol schedules were closely guarded secrets available only to senior officers. Information about reserve forces was restricted to a handful of personnel with the highest security clearances. Most dangerous of all, learning about planned preemptive strikes would require her to somehow access the personal communications of General Crook himself. But 3 years of operating her network had taught Ayanna lessons about information gathering that went far beyond anything Nailnish had originally envisioned. She had learned that the most sensitive intelligence was often revealed not through dramatic espionage, but through patient observation of seemingly insignificant details. Over the following weeks, she began assembling the information Nailnish needed through a combination of techniques that demonstrated how far her skills had evolved. Changes in duty rosters revealed which units were being prepared for extended operations. Increases in ammunition requisitions suggested the timing and scale of planned military actions. Most tellingly, modifications to telegraph schedules indicated when important communications were being sent to headquarters in Washington. The breakthrough came when she noticed that Dr. Williams had begun working longer hours and requesting additional medical supplies. When she carefully inquired about the reason, he mentioned in confidence that he had been asked to prepare for a significant increase in casualties, both military and civilian. This information, combined with other intelligence indicators, revealed that Crook was planning a massive preemptive sweep designed to eliminate all Apache resistance before winter weather made military operations impossible. The timing was crucial. Nailnish's coordinated strikes were planned for early November, but Crook's operation would begin in late October. If the military struck first, they would catch the Apache bands while they were positioning for their own attacks, potentially destroying the resistance movement entirely. Ayanna faced the moment Nailnish had warned her about. Getting this information to him would require using communication channels that might expose her entire network. But, failing to warn him would almost certainly result in catastrophic defeat for Apache forces throughout the territory. The decision she made reflected both her growth as a strategic thinker and her fundamental commitment to the Apache cause. Instead of simply passing the intelligence to Nailnish, she crafted a more ambitious plan that would both warn him and potentially neutralize the threat entirely. Using her position at the school, she began spreading carefully crafted rumors about increased Apache activity in areas far from where Nailnish's bands were actually operating. These rumors, passed through her network of contacts, eventually reached military intelligence officers who incorporated them into their operational planning. The result was a subtle but significant shift in the focus of Crook's planned sweep, directing military resources away from the areas where Apache forces were actually concentrated. Simultaneously, she arranged for information about the military operation to reach not only Nailnish but several other resistance leaders who could coordinate their responses. Rather than simply avoiding Crook's sweep, Apache forces could potentially use their advanced knowledge to strike at military columns while they were extended and vulnerable. But, the most audacious element of her plan involved deliberately exposing a portion of her own intelligence network. By allowing military investigators to discover some of her communication channels while protecting others, she could feed them false information about Apache plans and capabilities while maintaining her ability to gather intelligence through undiscovered sources. The execution of this plan required her to sacrifice relationships and resources she had spent years building. Several of her most valuable contacts had to be abandoned when their positions became too dangerous. Messages that could have saved Apache lives went undelivered because sending them would have compromised larger strategic objectives. Most painfully, she had to watch as several of her fellow prisoners were subjected to increased surveillance and interrogation based on intelligence trails she had deliberately created. When Crook's forces finally moved in late October, the results exceeded even Ayanna's most optimistic projections. Military columns found themselves attacking empty camps and chasing phantom bands while Apache fighters struck at supply lines and communication centers. The coordination between different resistance groups was so effective that many military commanders became convinced they were facing a much larger and more sophisticated enemy than actually existed. But, the true measure of success came 3 weeks later, when word arrived that General Crook had requested permission to negotiate with Apache leaders rather than continue pursuing a military solution. The combination of military frustration, economic losses, and political pressure in Washington had convinced senior officials that the cost of total victory over the Apache was higher than the territory was worth. The news reached the reservation through official channels, but Ayanna received confirmation through her own network hours before the announcement was made public. Nailnish's gamble had succeeded. For the first time in decades, Apache would negotiate with the United States government from a position of relative strength rather than abject defeat. As she listened to the celebration that erupted throughout the reservation when the news was officially announced, Ayanna experienced a complex mixture of triumph and melancholy. Her 3-year mission had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, but that success had come at a personal cost that was only now becoming clear to her. She had spent so long playing the role of the reformed Apache that returning to her original identity might no longer be possible. The skills she had developed and the relationships she had formed on the reservation were real, even if they were based on deception. The knowledge she had gained about white culture and society was valuable, but it had also changed her in fundamental ways that she was only beginning to understand. More immediately, the success of the peace negotiations would render her intelligence network largely unnecessary, leaving her to face questions about her own future that she had been avoiding for 3 years. Would she reveal her true role in the resistance and accept whatever consequences followed? Would she continue her masquerade and spend the rest of her life living a lie among people who had come to trust her? Or was there some third option that she had not yet imagined? The answer came in the form of another message from Nailnish, arriving just days after the official ceasefire was declared. This time, he was not requesting intelligence or warning of future trials. Instead, he was offering her something she had not dared hope for, a choice about her own destiny. "The peace we have won is fragile," his message read. "It will require constant vigilance and careful management to preserve. We need people who understand both worlds, who can move between Apache and white society as bridges rather than spies. Your cover identity could become your greatest asset in building the kind of future our people need to survive." The proposition was as challenging as anything she had previously undertaken. Rather than abandoning her dual identity, she could embrace it as a new kind of service to her people. Instead of gathering intelligence to aid military resistance, she could work to build the political and economic relationships that would make peaceful coexistence possible. It was a role that would require her to remain permanently balanced between two worlds, never fully belonging to either but serving as a crucial link between them. The loneliness and moral complexity of her current existence would continue, but with the possibility that her sacrifices might contribute to lasting peace rather than just temporary military advantage. As winter settled over the reservation, Ayanna began preparing for yet another transformation. The Apache girl who had once searched through garbage for survival, who had learned to fight with information and deception rather than arrows and bullets, was about to become something entirely new, a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for generations. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead would undoubtedly bring new trials and moral challenges. But, for the first time since she had followed Nailnish out of Tucson, Ayanna could see a horizon that promised something more than just survival, the possibility of a world where Apache children might grow up free without having to choose between their heritage and their lives. The girl who had been forged in desperation had become a woman capable of building hope from the fragments of a shattered world. Her story was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for a legacy that would extend far beyond her own remarkable journey of transformation and sacrifice.